It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large with Warner Lewis. 60 minutes of smart talk radio with interesting guests from all walks of life begins right now. So sit back and enjoy. And now, from the flight deck, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and that, of course, means some smart talk radio is in your future. This segment, no exception. This time we're going to be talking about American education, which we do from time to time. It has been a while with somebody that knows quite a bit about it. Filmmaker Bob Bowden. He's done many things. Produced a film called The Cartel, which we'll talk about briefly. We'll also talk about a new work called The Ticket. He also heads up a media production company, communication company called Choice Media, all of which we'll talk about over the next several minutes. Bob, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. I'm gearing up to meet your challenge of intelligent talk. I hope I'm up to it.
Well, here's what I know. Intelligent or not, it's the only thing that's being broadcast right now, so it's up to us to do it, right?
Okay.
All right. Anyway, Bob, let's do this. Let's do a little setup here for our Lewis at Large listeners that are not familiar with your work. Why this work? Why education? Why is it so important to you? Filmmaker first, then education, or was it education turned filmmaker?
Well, I've been a TV reporter and television host for a bunch of years first. I worked for Bloomberg Television for 6 years doing market news and, floor of the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ and doing, reports every quarter on, the latest Alcoa earnings and that kind of a gig. I had also hosted technology shows and for PBS, a public policy talk show that was nationally syndicated. But then I got started hearing from a friend of mine who had been in television but had switched jobs to become an inner-city public school teacher, a high school English teacher. And I started hearing her stories on a daily basis. And I just thought, I don't think a lot of people know what's going on today in American public high schools, particularly urban schools. And this kind of dysfunction that I was hearing about, quite frankly, deserved that kind of full coverage, the kind of in-depth coverage that a documentary could provide, long-form type coverage of a system, not just a one-off story of this high school or that, or this principal did something wrong, or this superintendent, might have been inspirational and charismatic, but a system story about public schools. And so I basically left my job and started shooting this documentary film called, ultimately, about corruption in public education that was called The Cartel. And it just took off. It exploded as soon as we started to go to film festivals. We ended up winning 12 film festival awards, not to mention other film festival, airings around the country, and started to get attention. And that ultimately led to Warner Brothers distribution, a national theatrical release, and so now it's on Netflix and iTunes and Amazon download, etc. And then I'm trying to make this. I'm really pontificating, but during the film release, though, people kept asking me, "What's your next topic going to be?" They were applying this kind of Michael Moore documentarian model to me, thinking that what I would do is pick a new topic. Now, because I was a successful documentary filmmaker, I would now move on to immigration or the drug war or, healthcare reform or some sort of other subject and do my next documentary film. But this subject matter it just had a hold of me in a way that I just couldn't find anything else that inspired me the way, both chronicling the dysfunctions of American public schools and also the hope of school choice and certain reforms. It just was more compelling to me than anything else. And so I started Choice Media, which is a firm that does nothing but education policy news online. And we now have a new film, as you referred, called The Ticket.
What are you, Bob, as you look around the landscape, who are your natural allies? And who, in theory, would be those that would disagree with you?
I think that most natural allies are parents who are frustrated with the schools their kids are going to. And by just saying it that way, there's millions of Americans who fit the description I just gave. All you need to look at is just even the dropout rate at many American schools. And it's not just urban. In many urban areas, it's over 50% of the kids don't finish high school. But even in some of the suburban areas where where it's supposed to, they spend a lot more money, they have a lot more kind of resources thrown at this problem, you'll still see, not only a lot of kids drop out, but even those that do finish often can't read their own diplomas, or they are not educated anywhere near a world standard, as we keep showing every time there's an international comparison. And so that's kind of a separate. The suburban problem is its own story. How a lot of parents, feel like if there's a brand new school and the kids tend to have new sneakers and new iPads, and there's not a violence problem, then they're in a good school. And in so many cases, there's not much learning going on.
Bob, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago or even a decade ago, would the issues be the same? Would you still be passionate? Are these things that are chronic and historic, or are these relatively new issues you're talking about?
Well, that's a good question. I think they have been around for at least a generation or two, depending on where you live. And I think that, while education historian is not a title I apply to myself, it does seem to me that when the teachers' unions became political, that's kind of when the landscape started to change, when they started advocating for candidates and giving campaign contributions. The teachers' union used to just be they ran a credit union, and they just wanted to, make sure the pension was okay and that kind of thing. And it started to turn into a political organization supporting candidates for office and handing money around, spreading money around. That's to me when kind of things started to wane in terms of the quality of American public schools. And you can see it by all kinds of measures. I would say that a lot of what's happened in the last 20 years is that the rest of the world's gotten better, and we've been basically flat while throwing more and more money all the time into the public schools. So we continue to shovel money as new inputs to the system, thinking that the more money we give, we'll just kind of buy our way out of the problem, or we feel guilty about what we know are failing urban schools. So we kind of hand them more and more money. But there's been little in the way of systemic change. Now, that said, one thing that is kind of new, you asked about the last 10 or 20 years or whatever, the reform efforts, the school choice efforts are new and emerging and exciting. So even just this year, 2013, brand new statewide voucher programs have been passed in North Carolina, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in Alabama. Other voucher programs expanded in places like Arizona. You have the charter school movement still growing at a double-digit rate, but 10 years ago it was nowhere near the size it is now. Now you have a couple million kids in charter schools. 5% basically of the American enrollment is in charters now. Cities like New Orleans are at 90% charter school. Washington, D.C., 50% of the kids in charter schools. That was not the case 10 and 20 years ago.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Bob Bowden, documentary, filmmaker, blogger, American education reporter indeed. Long history as a reporter in the real media, so to speak. Has now created his own real media company called Choice Media, and American education and issues surrounding it is their primary focus. Bob, we talk about these kind of things, and you said the world that you feel is sort of moving past us in terms of the level of education. But it's sort of the home run question, I guess, is how did we let it happen? What was in the petri dish that let this happen?
I think what let it happen is that there is a general feeling, sympathy towards public schools and public school teachers, that people generally thought they didn't, they were underpaid and they needed to be paid more. And so there was a general feeling that just investing, in public education was in and of itself a moral good. If you that giving this group more money was a moral thing to do in and of itself. So if the monies were sometimes wasted, squandered, spent on contractors, patronage jobs, unnecessary administration jobs, assistant superintendents of this and that weren't necessary and didn't affect kids, no one really cared. Because it was all just spending was a good thing in and of itself. And so that was, I think, the zeitgeist, if you will, that kind of led us into this, like, spend more. If you care about the kids, spend more, as kind of a, belief system or whatever in public education. And yeah, I also think campaign contributions to certain, mostly state politicians, created an era where rules like tenure got created, where in most places around the country for most of the last decade, short of committing a felony, you really couldn't get fired for cause if you were a public school teacher. I mean, you could be laid off if there was a huge enrollment drop, but those layoffs were, generally purely seniority based, so whoever was hired last. And if you and I were both public school teachers in the same school, and you had worked there 4 years and I worked there 5 years, but you really tried hard and cared about the kids every day with your 4 years of seniority, and I phoned it in with my 5 years of seniority, well, in an enrollment drop, they'd just let you go and they'd keep me. And I would be the lousy teacher and you were the good teacher, but it's too bad. It's too complicated to make any kind of assessment of quality, and so we'll just avoid that whole problem by making it purely seniority-based. No company would run that way. Everyone, even the most ardent defenders of public school teacher unions, would acknowledge that no private company would work that way, would announce on Monday morning that, hey, any of you want to just kind of phone it in and barely work each day and do the minimum, just so you know, you'll never be fired. And you'll be given raises, in fact, based purely on your years served. No one you have to be out of your mind to run a public company, a private company that way. And yet, but these are the kinds of things that got ushered in as part of American education policy because politicians were essentially paid off to sanction them.
Well, okay, with all of that as a base, let's take a look at this new work called The Ticket. Give us some background.
So, because of all the things I've just said, in the last, you'd say maybe 10 years or so, rounding off a bit, you have new movements of school choice because people are just there are some people who are coming around to acknowledge this problem. And so you have these different movements emerging, like the charter school movement is one. Homeschooling is another with large growth rates. Vouchers in the states where those are allowed, and as I pointed out before, there's more and more states with voucher programs, and cities like Washington, D.C., or Milwaukee, or Cleveland with just city-based voucher programs. So, and online learning emerging, growing by leaps and bounds. You have these different kinds of workarounds, these different kinds of ways to circumvent these problems I'm describing, but they have been kind of perceived as separate, disconnected, and even rivals. Like often the voucher people would hate the charter people, and charter people would hate the voucher people, and they would all, be looked askance by the homeschooling people. And so what this new film, The Ticket, is about, which is going to be released in January, it's basically this new realization that around a concept, a unifying kind of umbrella concept called school choice, these previously autonomous movements are starting to converge. They're converging under this one central idea of school choice. And that simply means that the parents have a better incentive to decide what's the best education for kids than a bureaucracy. Because parents are not distracted by, influenced by, marred by things like salary schedules, job protections, campaign contributions, all that stuff that was a part of the kind of public school establishment. Parents are only operating in the best interest of the kids, not the best interest of all these employees. And so that's the premise, that's the kind of philosophical underpinning that all of these different school choice movements like charters and vouchers and online and homeschooling are beginning to converge, and that's what the film is about.
How I'm curious as to, and again, I'm politicizing this just a little bit just for our listeners to get a sense of, who's sort of siding with who here. And I think we all want what's best for kids, but it's probably a different way of approaching it. Who was jazzed to help you and who was not?
Well, it's not. It doesn't line up along traditional political lines usually, in the sense of Republican Democrat kind of lines. Education reform is There are many Democrats that support it, and there are many Republicans who get in the way. We just actually released today a brand new video on the Choice Media website. We have a newswire every day of education policy headlines and original videos. We released one today, an interview with former Washington, D.C. Mayor Adrian Fenty, who is a Democrat, lifelong Democrat. And on the video that we released today, he says the Democratic Party is generally very misguided on this subject and will generally support teachers' unions to the detriment of kids. So he does kind of call it in those terms. I kind of resist that because I know there are some Democrats like him who do fight for school choice and education reform. But anyway, but largely the answer is that it's a mixture of supporters and detractors, and it's any movement in America, any kind of social argument for social change, there are always people who resist the change, whether it's ending slavery or the woman's right to vote or you name it, any civil rights or in the 1960s or any kind of effort for social change. There are people who are wedded to the past, and this is no different than that. There are people who are very invested in the status quo, failing public education system. Even in the worst school that you could imagine, there are people who, some of them do work hard, and even in the worst schools, some of those people who work hard do have families and mortgages and kids in college and bills to pay, and some of them see the school choice movement as an attack on their lifestyle, on their world, on their family income, and resist for those reasons, even though ultimately it's it's a complex issue where in many cases what's best for kids may not be what's best for employees, and some of those employees fight against the reforms out of defending their lives and their families.
It sounds again like another political question here, but just in terms of, Bob, from what you've seen around the country, you find more people in favor of this in larger cities or in smaller communities or out west, down south, up north? Is there any kind of pattern at all to those that are pro versus against?
Not geographic. I'll tell you that. I mean, if I gave you a list of the 5 most reformed states with respect to education, they would be all over the place. I would say Florida, Arizona, Indiana, Louisiana, and Wisconsin would be probably the 5 states I would give. That's Northwest. Probably not the Northeast. The Northeast would be an area where I would say that's a paucity of reform seems to be the case. But in some big cities, there are 5% of New York City kids in charter schools. Like I said, almost half of the D.C. kids, about 44%, are in charter schools. So it's a mix in terms of like urban, suburban. It's a real weird thing where in many urban areas you have the parents clamoring most for a chance at school choice, at a voucher program, at charter schools. They will wait in line overnight. They will, come to every, lottery every year or twice a year for a chance to get their kid into a better school. But then oftentimes that same demographic will vote for the very people who do not support the kinds of educational options that those parents themselves wait in line for. So that's an irony. And meanwhile, on the kind of suburban Republican demographic side, there are plenty of people who, support the concept of school choice and school competition makes sense, and they know competition drives quality in all kinds of other realms of their lives. Whether it's iPhone versus Android or Nike versus Reebok or, American car companies getting better once Japanese cars got introduced. There are people that generally recognize competition makes people better, drives quality upward. And yet, in their own, suburban school district, they'll often say, well, we don't need school choice here. I mean, our schools are good, so we don't need them. When in fact, their neighbor across the street may want a different school option because maybe their kid was bullied, or maybe their kid is special needs and isn't being served well, or maybe their kid it wants a vocational program and there is none in their suburban school, or all kinds of other reasons that we maybe haven't even thought of all the possible school models that could serve various kinds of kids. So there's a kind of a contradiction, I think, wherever you look, whatever demographic you kind of slice apart here and analyze, there are some peculiarities in terms of how people vote and support this notion, and that's why we do what we do, is to we're trying to change hearts and minds and get this information out so people begin to think of education more like anything else, like something that for which there should be choices.
Bob, in a perfect world, would we have charter schools, or in a perfect world would public education as it was originally drawn up have worked?
In a perfect world, in my perfect world, there's the same amount of money that follows the kid to whatever school the parent chooses. And if the public school in a certain place, and there are certainly good public schools out there, it's obvious. There are some schools that are just doing great. And if that's the case, then those parents pick those schools, then those are the schools that prosper. And, I'm not against public education. I'm just for parents having a choice. And so the money should follow the kid if they want to pick a private school. In my ideal world, yeah, there is a marketplace. Think of it like package delivery with you can send a package with the post office. You can also send it with Federal Express. You can also send it with UPS. And in this kind of way, you could think of and same with universities. There are public universities and private universities that compete with each other all the time and have done so for decades, and no one thinks that's strange. So the same way a Pell Grant would follow a kid, which is government money, which would follow a kid to either a private school or a public, a private college or a public college, that same government scholarship, it ought to be the same with K through 12. There's no reason it shouldn't.
Well, let's, as we start to wind down here just a little bit, do you find yourself, and again, you're one-off a little bit, you're not in the middle of the education system, but you're certainly a very interested observer of it. Or do you find yourself more hopeful and with a positive eye to the future, or do you feel like things are getting worse?
Oh no, we're happy warriors here, I think, in the ed reform movement, because we are winning. We're just winning very slowly. But all the grand movement is in our direction. Like every year, there are never fewer kids in voucher programs. It's always more. Every year, there are never fewer kids in charter schools. It's always more. It's always more doing online learning. It's always more doing homeschooling. It's never that the public schools monopolies are, gaining market share in this regard. So so we are winning. We're just winning too slowly. And, a kid only has second grade once. And if they get a bad teacher in second grade, that's pretty bad. And then if they get another bad teacher in third grade, or worst case scenario, fourth grade, they'll probably just never catch up. I mean, so when I say that we're winning, but we're winning too slowly, there's an urgency. In other words, that a lot of us feel in this movement that, while we are winning, we really can't rest on our laurels because there's so much more to do. But we're certainly not dispirited because, generally when people are when parents, unaffiliated parents who aren't getting money from the public schools and don't have a relative who's in a principal or something like that, when they hear the general concept of like, hey, wouldn't it be good to have options of schools? They're buying this argument. They are buying this argument. We're just we need to get better at making it.
Well, again, you've done the cartel, you've done the ticket, you're doing a lot of other things. What's your next big project?
Oh, you already got me another homework assignment. We haven't rolled out this film yet.
I'm setting up another interview.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we actually are looking into creating some ad campaigns around the country that would actually run on broadcast television to counter some of the union-financed TV commercials that run all the time around the country. And so, we are media people and video producers, and and that's kind of our core competency, if you will. And so that's something we're preparing a launch for one market. And it's too early to announce what the market is, but we're thinking about this as a replicable strategy that could be employed around the country in terms of messaging to kind of say, the other side wants to describe school choice as a corporate takeover privatization scheme for billionaires to enrich themselves by, taking over public schools. And what that narrative ignores is all these parents who are picking and taking advantage of the school lot. They're all using these charters and vouchers all over the country by the millions, and more of them all the time. And once you put those parents in front of a camera and let them tell their stories about how their daughter's life was saved because she got out of the horrible gang-infested public school and is now at a charter or a voucher school and is now happy and is now not afraid and is now learning. You put enough of those parents on camera telling that story, and that privatization billionaire, narrative just wilts and disappears. So that's what we're looking to do.
Well, it is an interesting discussion indeed. It gets people's blood boiling either way, usually, but a good he is indeed Bob Bowden. He is with Choice Media. He is a documentarian. Is that right? Are you a documentarian?
I guess so. That's why I made documentary films. I guess, yeah, that makes me that.
He has a workout called The Cartel, a new one called The Ticket, all about American education. Bob, how can people find out more? Let's give a little Choice Media here a little bit of a plug.
Sure.
How can they find out more about you guys and also about the work that you do?
Well, one real easy way is for people who listen to podcasts, they can just enter in the Ed Reform Minute. That's our daily podcast. You can find it on iTunes or Stitcher or TuneIn. Any of the podcast software has it. It's called the Ed Reform Minute, and they can check out our daily podcast. You could also go to choicemedia.tv and see our everything, our newswire, our original videos. I mean, every day. There's not only are there lots of news stories every day, but our website has a interactive map. You can click on a certain state on the bottom left of the homepage of choicemedia.tv. Click on whatever state you're interested in and get just the education reform stories or education policy stories pertaining to that one state. And there's nothing else like it on the internet, so we're proud of that too. It's at choicemedia.tv.
Hey, thanks for sharing part of your day with us. I know you're busy and interesting subject indeed, and do appreciate it.
Anytime. Thanks, Warner.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.